All right, welcome everyone. If you would like to say hi in the chat, just let us know if you're there. That would be great. Welcome to SEL and PBIS, Integrating Social Emotional Learning into Established PBIS Systems. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. We really appreciate you. My name is Colleen Ferreira, and I am the coordinator of social emotional learning at the Orange County Department of Education. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Ginny Joseph, who is the coordinator of PBIS at the Orange County Department of Education too. And we are going to be going over a couple of things with you today about integrating SEL and PBIS. We're going to be looking at the students within our systems, looking at those practices, and then we'll also shift our focus to the adults and looking at some of those practices and systems that can support the adults who work with our students. All right, today we do have a participant guide for you that should have been made available to you. Everything that we'll be presenting today is on there. You'll have access to our slides, some additional resources, and an activity that we'll be doing with you today as well.
We just want to share with you, we're having some technical difficulties and we don't have control of our slides. So please bear with us while we try to navigate this kind of behind the scenes.
There will be a lot of wait time today, but a lot of time for reflection and deep thinking. So we'll start with a SEL practice, one of the 3 signature SEL practices, and it's called a welcoming ritual. And it really helps to, ground us and kind of bring our focus and invite voices into the room. So our welcoming activity today is to think of 3 words that describe how you're feeling right now. And that could be 3 separate words. It could be a 3-word phrase. Just think about how you're feeling right now. And you can share that in the chat box if you would like, or just write them down for yourself, just to kind of think about where you're coming into this space. All right, thank you for engaging with that. Just taking a moment for reflection. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ginny to kind of ground us in the work that we're going to be thinking about today, especially with PBIS.
Okay, I'm still waiting for that next slide to come up, but oh, I think it's coming. Here it is. So we wanted to take a moment to describe 4 essential elements of implementation of any major new initiative or project. And we want to talk about that as it relates to Tier 1 implementation of PBIS. So how we like to think of these 4 essential elements is as having equity at the center, and that's not its own essential element, it's just always there, but we like to put it right at the center of everything we're doing. But we start with the outcomes. And the outcomes are anything that is meaningful, measurable, observable, that we want all students to achieve. And this is really going to drive what we do in our schools. And we'll always be referring back, no matter what we're doing, to those measurable, observable outcomes. So the first thing we want to talk about, though, is within that outcome circle, because that kind of encapsulates everything we do, is the systems, practices, and data. And I like to start with the practices, and that refers to anything that we're doing with students to achieve those important outcomes. So that could be a specific intervention, but with regards to PBIS, it's those essential Tier 1 practices, such as the developing the 3 to 5 school-wide expectations, teaching those directly, acknowledging and coming up with an acknowledgement system in your school building, monitoring and correcting any unwanted behaviors, and using the data to make decisions about, do we need to revise or revamp those practices? And then, of course, all along the way, we're going to be getting our educational partner input and feedback so that we know that we're implementing the right practices for all students. And then the data circle, there are a couple types of data that we always want to be coming back to, and that includes measuring our fidelity of implementation. Are we actually doing those practices the way they were meant to be implemented? And if we are we achieving those important student outcomes that we want to achieve? And then the third circle is around systems, and the systems are anything that's supporting the adults in the building. And so for that might be, having a team and teaming systems, and action planning within that team, providing professional development for staff who aren't on the team to implement those practices with fidelity, coming up with that acknowledgement system and monitoring it, systems for monitoring the data. All of those 4 elements are essential to implementing anything like PBIS or SEL. And often when things aren't going well, or when things start to kind of fall apart, we go back to those 4 essential elements and we figure out, which piece is kind of missing, because usually there's something that's missing or hasn't been set in place that we need to go back to and firm up. So I'm just keeping those things in mind as in terms of PBIS, and really wanted to lay the foundation for when we're talking about implementing or integrating SEL into current PBIS systems. This is kind of what we have in mind for the Tier 1 piece for PBIS. So these are the things that we want to have in place so that we can effectively bring in those SEL components and integrate them. So I'll turn it over back over to Colleen to talk about the CASEL focus areas of implementation.
Thanks, Ginny. So you'll notice when you look at the 4 focus areas of implementation from CASEL's guidance that there is a lot of common language, a lot of shared language. So just like the systems in PBIS, these are the systems that we really have in place. And when we think about the practices, you can see those in the green areas for the practices that support the adults and for the students. And then you can clearly see the data piece in that blue continuous improvement. And so we have a lot of the same systems, a lot of the same structures, and a lot of the same focus areas in terms of practices and equity. And so let me go ahead and let them know we're going to go to the next slide. We're going to look first at the students in our system, and we're going to be thinking about practices for social emotional learning and PBIS.
Okay, so one thing that Colleen and I believe is that behavior is a form of communication. We know many of you believe the same thing, that we need to be thinking about, if something is happening in our environment and we're seeing some of those unwanted behaviors, it's communicating a need that isn't being met by the student. And so we really need to pay close attention to that, because that means that some fundamental need is not being met, and we need to reevaluate what's happening so that we can make sure that we're developing those safe environments for students. So in terms of doing that, over the next several minutes, we're going to talk about some ways that social emotional competencies can be integrated into existing PBIS practices for students. And we will demonstrate that through defining social emotional learning and sharing some of those classroom practices from SEL, and sharing the way that SEL and PBIS complement each other. And so with that, Colleen's going to talk to us about what is social emotional learning.
Thanks, Ginny. So the first thing that we're going to look at is really what is social and emotional learning. It's talked about a lot, especially in the last couple of years. And we're going to really dig into exactly what does that look like in our system. I'm going to go ahead and let them know next again so we can take a look at the overall idea.
Colleen, I'll do it. I got it.
There we go. There it's coming. All right. So much fun. And in its simplest explanation, when we talk about social and emotional learning within a multi-tiered system of support, it's universal, just like PBIS. It is inclusive, just like PBIS. And again, it is proactive instruction and practices that support all of our students. So you'll see a lot of the same language, a lot of the same ideas with SEL and PBIS. And on the next slide, we're going to take a look. Oh, we'll keep on going. We can do next, please, again. There's our definition from Castle. Oh, we're going to keep going again. Ginny, isn't it interesting how these slides are a little bit different from our short up version? But look at the overview that we have. Oh, I hope everybody in the audience can appreciate the the pitfalls of technology when it's just not on your side. So we're gonna go ahead and dive into the how of social emotional learning. Apparently, our slides were not updated, but we're going to take a look at the 10 indicators right now. And the 10 indicators are really at the heart of like, what does SEL look like in a system, in a school-wide systemic SEL? And so within the social emotional learning framework, we not only have the 5 competencies of awareness, thank you so much, Beatrice, self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. But we also have these contexts. They happen within the classroom, they happen at home, they happen in our communities, and they're supported in many different ways through the climate and culture, through an explicit SEL curriculum, how it's integrated in the classroom, which all would be beneficial if you saw the actual picture of the Castle framework. But I do hope that some of you have seen it so that I'm not just painting a picture in your mind. And when we think about how can we disaggregate that framework and what it looks like in the school, you can see that blue stripe vertically on the left, where within the classroom, what are we going to be seeing? We're going to see explicit SEL instruction being taught. We're going to see it integrated into academics. We're going to see that youth voice and engagement are a priority. And when within the school as a system, you're going to see those supportive classroom climates. A lot of this, I'm sure you're thinking, oh, that really aligns to PBS. That's what PBIS supports too, and how they really complement each other. And you are also going to see within the school how adults are supported and how their social emotional needs are being supported. You'll see that discipline is aligned to the social emotional competencies. And we have our continuum of integrated supports as our California MTSS framework that we just kind of drove by really quickly. And then again, you have those authentic family and community partnerships. And so when we think about what does school-wide SEL look like, when we think about that framework, these are the 10 indicators that we really focus on. We'll go ahead and click next.
It's kind of a surprise. What's going to come out?
I was thinking the exact same thing, Ginny. I was like, what's it going to be now? Yeah. So I'm glad I was expecting this. And so when we think specifically, if we just hone in on those classroom practices, and we know with any initiative, just like PBIS, SEL is the same, it's not just about the classroom, but if we are focusing just on that classroom piece, we're looking at really 3 big bucket areas. We're looking at that explicit instruction, we're looking at how it's integrated into academics, but this supportive classroom environment piece is really prime opportunity for where SEL and PBIS can complement each other, can integrate with one another, and really ultimately support one another. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ginny to shore up and remind us about some really great strengths that PBIS has in this area. And then we'll kind of segue and look at how SEL can complement that.
Okay, so hopefully some of you have seen or are familiar with this document. It's a document that the Center on PBIS put out a while ago, but they just updated it in January of this year. It's called Supporting and Responding to Students' Social, Emotional, and Behavioral Needs, Evidence-Based Practices for Educators. And it's really specific to the classroom practices. And it's linked in the guide that we gave you. And it's a PDF document that has live links throughout it, and it kind of jumps you around the document depending on what you're looking for. So I love the way that this is set up, because in that first column, you have a list of components and ideas of how to create positive teaching and learning environments. So those are the types of things that you would set up your classroom for before students even arrive. And think of also how to develop relationships with families and students before they even step into your classroom. And then in that second column, once they're in your classroom and school is going, how do we actively promote social, emotional, behavioral growth? And so within those 2 columns, you'll see like 5 different components, and within those components, each one has like its own little section within the document, and there's a lot of examples and resources within each one. And just to explain what the columns 3 and 4 are, that's really about, okay, now you've done those things in the first couple of columns, you know, how do we monitor how well we're doing those things, and if they're if those student outcomes are being achieved. Okay, so on the next slide, I'm actually not sure that I have the correct next slide, but let's see. Oh, it's going. Oh, yeah, I don't. Colleen, did you want to talk about this?
No, not really. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay. Well, and I can say a lot of these things, this is actually was kind of like a happy thing when Colleen and I were putting this together and talking about how SEL and PBIS integrate, because a lot of these classroom practices that she wanted to bring forward for you all, they are in that supporting and responding to students' social, emotional, and behavioral needs. And so I thought that was just so cool that I was like, oh yeah, these things all are connected. And so we're really talking about the same things when we talk about implementing PBIS in the classroom and bringing, forth a supportive classroom environment when Colleen is talking about SEL. So you can add to that too. I'm sure I didn't talk about everything you wanted to point out there.
No, that's exactly it. It was a really cool aha moment when you were like, oh, well, let me show you this resource from PBIS. And I was like, oh my gosh, there it is. And there it is. These resources are also included in that participant guide for you, along with that handbook that Ginny was going into. So just something to kind of highlight for you right there. The layers of support. Let's see what's next. All right. So, okay, yes, we have our next slide in place. We are going to be talking about the integration. How can SEL really strengthen PBIS? How can PBIS strengthen social emotional learning within the classroom? And crossing my fingers that the next slide is what I'm expecting it to be. We can just go on to the next one. All right, it is. Okay, perfect. Now, if you're familiar with social emotional learning at all, classroom shared agreements, or sometimes called the classroom charter, is really a high leverage practice that's encouraged throughout all schools. And these are agreements that are co-constructed with students. And so the teacher acts more as a facilitator, And we'll generate general questions like, how do we want to feel at school each day? And the students' voices are elevated, and they're the ones who are generating these responses. Another question would be, how can we, the teacher and the students, how can we experience these feelings as often as possible? Like, what are our behaviors? What are the procedures? What are the routines? And your PBIS minds are probably like, yes, 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 this is very familiar. And then the last question is, well, what can we do? Like, how do we problem solve if we're not living these shared agreements? If we're not feeling these things, if we're not behaving in these ways, how do we settle these problems? And so a really great way to be able to integrate your classroom matrix is to be able to meld that with the same ideas behind the classroom shared agreements. So if you are a school that already is doing PBIS, you already have classroom shared agreements, it would be a little silly to then also additionally do classroom shared agreements because they're essentially doing the same thing. They have the same goal. And so how you can do this is when you are creating your classroom matrix, you could do it in the same way where you're elevating student voices. You are putting yourself as the educator within that matrix as well for how you are going to behave. How do you want to feel? How are you going to support the students with this? And it's a great way to be able to do both practices and still be able to support the social emotional needs of the students, being able to put yourself in that position and maintaining those behaviors and expectations within your classroom. And I think we can go to the next slide now.
Okay, so this is another great resource from the Center on PBIS about, and it just was recently published in August of this year, if you haven't had a chance to check it out. And it's really about co-constructing a classroom teaching matrix. So bringing those school-wide expectations in the classroom, really bringing in student voice, to identify, which behaviors are important to teach, what do we need to take more time on, what needs to be kind of differentiated between, here is really how we need this to happen at school, and taking the time to have the conversations of how it might look different at home or with friends or with relationships or in community settings. So if you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to check that out. And then hopefully on the next slide, we have an example of what some of the things inside of that document would look like. So this is from one of our Orange County schools. And their expectations were responsible, own my choices, act with integrity and respect. And they say this is how we roar. And obviously, this is an elementary school. And this is specifically a first grade classroom that we were visiting. And within the first week of school, they're having these conversations in their classroom with the students about what does it mean to you to be responsible in the classroom, to own your choices, to act with integrity, etc. So obviously they hadn't gotten all the way through all of them. But the students were taking Post-it notes and writing down, what does it mean to me to be responsible in the classroom? So and they stuck them. This is on a poster in the classroom, and they stuck them there to lend voice to what those things meant to them. And then on the next slide, it takes that a little bit further to, that was really the general case. At school, what do you think this should look like? And the students give their ideas and examples. And then just so that we make sure students feel validated, and if it looks different at home, that's okay, but sometimes we need to change our behavior depending on our environment, right? So, we would act differently if we were at a dinner party than if we were at a concert. So same kind of ideas. So allowing each student to have this opportunity to express, at school, we're going to agree that it might look like this. At home, for me, it looks like this. With my friends, it might look like this. And so you can share that however you like, either whole group or independently. This even works with our very young students. We've had them draw pictures of what this means to them and share. Might take a little bit more time to get through for them to explain what their pictures are showing, but you can adapt it for any age. And then on the next slide, I'm hoping there's a sample classroom teaching matrix there that we borrowed from. Yes, we borrowed this from our friends at Midwest PBIS. And this is from a high school. And what they did is in that left-hand column there, you'll see that there's their expectations. The last row is actually the teacher's role. And so we're going to talk about adults in just a moment. But what they did is, how is what the teacher or the staff doing supporting what is inside that classroom teaching matrix? And then they have in each of the subsequent columns, what are the rules and routines within the classroom? And I love the one for when you feel upset. So it's kind of normalizing that idea of, we all feel upset at some point, and then talking through and developing some strategies for what to do when people do feel upset. And then in those arrows there, we're just showing how you can identify and should be able to identify those CASEL core competencies within your matrix. So, so those are just highlighted some of the ideas that we felt like were connected to some of those CASEL core competencies. Okay, next slide, please.
All right, thanks, Ginny. And when we think about the matrix, especially when it was talking about what you can do, if you feel upset, a lot of that really taps into the student's ability to self-manage, right? And to be able to demonstrate self-control. And so when we're thinking about students demonstrating self-control with either the classroom matrix or by itself, or if you choose to integrate it with these, classroom shared agreements, we want to be thinking about how we're supporting the students' self-regulation so that they can demonstrate self-control. And really at the core of this is relationships. This is a big integration piece that connects social emotional learning and PBIS. We know that strong, authentic relationships are the keys to mitigating trauma, creating a supportive environment, and really supporting the student self-regulation. So if we want to be able to do that, we have to create these conditions that support regulation. And PBIS has great guidance on this, and SEL has strategies that add additional layers of support to this. And so this is just a snippet of one tool that we have included for you with several other tools about how you can support relationship building in an authentic way and to really reflect on how relationship rich your classroom is to be able to support the students' self-regulation. So again, this is in the participant guide for you. And if we go on to the next slide, we're going to shift our focus to our adults in our system. And this is a really great piece that social emotional learning brings to a school that has PBIS in place to really think about mirroring what we are doing with the students with the adults in our system.
Colleen, I'm just wondering if folks have any questions about the student piece before we move on to the adult piece.
Sure.
If anybody has questions and want to type them in the chat about any of those resources, I know we're going kind of quickly just so that we can get all the way through it. I know there's a little lag too, so maybe a few seconds and then just move on.
If anybody types as slowly as I am, we should give them a good 4 minutes. Also, please feel free to type move on. No questions.
We're good. Yeah. Okay.
All right. If anything, if you're still typing and it pops up at the next slide, we'll go ahead and we'll stop and address that. So we'll go ahead and we'll talk for a little bit now as we kind of are finishing up with examining the shift in strategy, building upon the idea of prevention at the universal tier 1 level, and really think about promoting wellness for all, which is, of course, inclusive of being intentional about the adults in our system. Could you go ahead and go on to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Thanks, Angelica. All right, thank you. So we know that educators, of course, they're struggling with stress. We are having a huge burnout problem with our educators for, a lot of very valid reasons. And the key to addressing this really begins with our self-awareness. So the way that burnout begins is it begins in its beginnings, I should say, with chronic stress, but then it moves to that mental exhaustion and then a deep sense of disillusionment. And what is so haunting about burnout is that it mainly strikes people who are really committed to their jobs. The idea is you can only burn out if you've been a light in the first place. So in other words, those superstars that you work with, you look up to them for modeling, for advice, you really admire their work ethic, they begin to slowly burn out when they are not self-aware and practicing those self-care strategies that really prevent them from reaching the burnout level. And so one way to address this as an organization is really to do frequent check-ins. I know a principal who is in Orange County, I should say. And during the pandemic, she started this practice of sending out a daily Google form to her teachers. And they just responded to it daily. Like, how are you feeling? How can I support you? Any super, super quick. It can be done in 30 seconds. And it really gave the principal the temperature of what was going on with her staff and how she could support them. And this is something that she has continued since, because it really helped to not only build trust, but to help her really understand what was going on with the adults. If you cannot do something like this daily, doing this practice, a check-in weekly at staff meetings, is also a really great practice. It gives space for everybody to have voice in a circle. And you can share, you can support one another, you can realize that you are not alone in this, and it really helps to build community and trust within the group. Next slide, please. All right, we got a couple of questions just about the resources. They should be shared with you on the participant guide. And I believe that was shared when you decided to join this session. It should be available to you. If you cannot find it, please let us know, and we'll make sure that we get that link to you, or Sung can help us in directing you where you can find it on the platform. So yes, all these resources will be available to you. Go ahead and please go to the next slide. Please go to the next slide. Thank you so much. Now, when we're thinking about adult social emotional learning, learning needs to have this balanced approach between passive learning and active learning. And the passive learning really consists of absorbing and considering the new knowledge. Like, we just went over the 10 indicators. We looked at what and the how of social emotional learning. That's building your own capacity, like really understanding what is social emotional learning, so you can speak to it, to other stakeholders. But then being able to translate that information with actively thinking about it, discussing it, reflecting, analyzing, that takes you to the active part of practicing social emotional learning. So we're going to be taking you through a couple of active approaches and thinking about building your own adult social emotional learning. If we could go to the next slide. Thank you. So one way to really begin with the foundations of practicing SEL is to build your emotional literacy. And this is a tool from Ruler, the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And it has a vast vocabulary of emotional words. The way that you do this practice is really to help teach yourself to think in terms of, how am I feeling right now? Am I being triggered? Am I feeling very content right now? What is the reason for that? Do I want to stay in this emotion right now, or do I want to shift it? And really just being in tune with not only yourself, but then also being able to discuss this either with your students or with other adults that you work with is a skill that you will continue practicing as the years go on. And so the way that this tool works is on the x-axis, you go from low pleasantness at a 0 all the way up to high pleasantness. You went all the way to the right. And then vertically, we have low energy to high energy. And that's how these emotions are sorted. And these emotions are useful during different times of your life, during different times of the day. If you are presenting, perhaps you want to be in that yellow area where you're happy, you're motivated, you're inspired. If you are thinking about learning something new, perhaps you want to be in that green area where you're comfortable, you're feeling fulfilled. If you are upset about an injustice, you're probably going to be in the red for good reason. So this is just really thinking about where you are emotionally without judgment. So this is a great tool for you to start using for yourself. Also having that common shared language with the adults that you work with. And of course, building the emotional vocabulary of your students as well. So it's a great practice for both the students and the adults. And on the next slide, we have another tool for you to really think about in terms of practicing. These are practices for being proactive. They are intentional practices that you can do every day, and it helps to build your emotional well-being. It's kind of like building up cognitive reserves that will support your resilience in, the inevitable times when you are going to be triggered and experiencing challenges. And so it's really helpful for you to take a moment just to really think, which one of these strategies do you go to when you want to relax at the end of a stressful day? Really being intentional and really thinking about what you can do proactively. What are your go-tos when you're feeling angry or frustrated? Do you go find social support? Do you have somebody that you trust that you can vent to if you're having frustrations, with your job? What do you do, when you're trying to relax? Do you do some mindful breathing? Do you visualize? Do you use humor? All of these are really positive ways to really help build your resilience. And if we go on to the next slide, I'm wondering if we've got it. We've got it, Ginny.
Yay. Okay. So I'm sorry. I was just getting myself off mute. So this is a tool we'd like to have you all engage in. And so on the left-hand side, you'll see some of those strategies that Colleen just walked us through. And if you could either, I think we have this as a resource for you, if that can get dropped in the chat. We have this slide for you that you can, I believe it should make a forced copy. And you can just save it on your own. We want you to spend some time with this. And if it's not coming up, just maybe if you have a Post-it handy or something to write with, even putting a note in your phone, what are some of those behaviors that, just they escalate you right away. They just right away, you're going to have a reaction to it, whether it's while students are present or if it's while you're in a meeting after school or just in general, what are those things that are for sure going to escalate you? And then, so maybe one comes up to mind really quickly, one or two, and then with those things in mind, so considering, where that behavior might happen that's escalating or triggering, what's happening in that environment and what strategy might you be able to use to be able to stay calm in that moment? So we'll allow, I think we could use maybe 2 to 3 minutes on this. Oh, I think the bit.ly is being flashed at the bottom of the screen there. So if you want to do that in the slide, you would get access to that slide itself to fill in. Otherwise, just take some quick notes on what is triggering for you and what is a strategy. And maybe it's one of those on the screen, and maybe it's something you use and would like to share with the whole group in the chat. So I'm going to be quiet for just a couple of minutes and let you think about that. Okay, just a few seconds left, and I see, thank you, Andrea or Andrea. There's my timer, so I didn't forget. For sharing your trigger, and it says, when the general education teacher forgets to include the students in my class to the kindergarten activity. Another trigger, when administrator, secretary, or visitor enters my classroom unannounced and starts talking. Yes. So
Yep.
what are some strategies that we can, because we know that's a trigger and that really gets us going inside, and we want to make sure that we're regulated so that our students aren't then feeding off of that dysregulation. And maybe also modeling a strategy for them of when you are feeling triggered and what you would do in that moment. So what is something that you could do in that moment to help you remain calm or bring you back to a state of calm?
Mm-hmm. I knew a teacher who would do that with her students when the students were actually triggering her. And she would just take a breath and she would just say, I am breathing right now and I'm thinking about how I am feeling very anxious, and just like do that whole talk out loud to them. And just the very act of doing that was very calming for her. And the students' faces looked like amazed, like what is going on here, and it was such a good example for them because they'd never seen that before.
I love the talking through it, because then students see like the process that happens in the head. So it's not just this whole internal thing, which we might do, but it really makes it come to life for them as well. Okay, thank you for sharing in the chat. And then I think we can go on to the next slide. Would that be all right? Colleen, I think
That would be fantastic. Yes, thank you. Thanks for walking us through that activity, and that's available for you on the participant guide as well. And I forget if we announced it. Sung told us that the resources are available on the agenda for the session within the Socio Events website or app. So that's all available to you on the platform with this session. So to wrap it up today, we are going to be talking about some explicit collaboration approaches that the adults could do in the system that will really not only support trust building, but also support kind of walking the walk of what we also expect of our students. And so the first one that we'll talk about on the next slide is a high leverage practice that we do. And oh no, nope, let's just keep on going. That was a surprise. Keep going. Next slide. The meme. Okay, well, you guys got the meme. We originally cut this. This is one of my favorite memes ever because it really resonated with me when I was a classroom teacher. Why is it that administrators are always telling us, we have to promote engagement with our classrooms? And then every week the staff meeting was like, that could have been an email, what we could transition to death very easily during many of those things. Go ahead and take us to the next slide. I'm hoping that's it. Bingo. Perfect. So one of these high leverage practices that we use in social emotional learning that supports the adults climate, it's also a way to reflect and practice on these school-wide expectations that we have within PBIS. And the way that staff shared agreements work, very similar again to the practice that we do with our students. And we just talked about how creating classroom shared agreements can really help to elevate voice, create ownership over these ways of being. When we do this as staff and as the adults, we're agreeing of ways of being amongst each other. And so we're thinking about how do we treat each other? How do we treat our families? These things, we need to get really explicit about it. And when we do that, when we can really articulate and quantify, how are we going to collaborate and be with each other as adults, we're thinking now, how does that inform how you are supporting the school-wide expectations for the students? And is there an opportunity for the adults to really reflect on the similarities or differences that they have with their shared agreements to the school-wide expectations for the students? And it really changes your perception in terms of, well, this is an expectation that we have as adults, but am I asking too much of the students if I wouldn't even practice that as an adult? So it just gives you some time to reflect after you are actually practicing these same things that you were doing with your students. It gives you a chance to walk in their shoes and really think about these routines and expectations that you're asking of the students because you yourself are doing them with your own colleagues. And this matrix is even set up in a very similar fashion to our PBIS school-wide expectations. And so it's a very easy crossover to be able to start thinking about ways to integrate. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ginny.
Okay, and so on the next slide, I think we have an example of a matrix. So kind of continuing on from those ideas that Colleen just shared, if this were a school's expectation matrix for the school-wide setting, classroom isn't included here, but if this were a school's expectations and some of those rules and routines that we teach, how am I as the adult in the building modeling and living these behaviors with my peers, kind of like how Colleen said. So if we value those behaviors as a community, these behaviors here, for example, it should apply to all, so students as well as staff. And on the next slide, another way of kind of incorporating some of those SEL pieces. So these are some of the pieces that we try to incorporate in every presentation, sometimes limiting to do the engaging practices, depending on like a platform like this, we can't speak directly to you. or write back in the chat too, but we are responding verbally as much as we can. But we have our welcoming ritual. So we opened with kind of that grounding activity. We try to have engaging practices throughout to avoid falling asleep in the meeting. And then at the end, making sure we have an optimistic closure or kind of like a reflection opportunity or something that allows us to look forward or use something that we've learned, and be very intentional about our closing practices in the meeting. Next slide, please. So one way of doing this, the teams that we train here in Orange County use something called the team-initiated problem-solving model, and you see that kind of table format agenda, and that is the agenda that comes out of that. It's sort of an approach to, it's not sort of, it is an approach to help teams meet more efficiently and effectively. And one thing that we've been doing is to encourage folks to put in there, you know, a welcoming ritual at the beginning, and then at the end, kind of a closing activity to reflect on the meeting. And of course, this can be very simple. You know, it is meant to be very quick. Just check in. You could do that if you're on Zoom. You know, put an emoji in the chat, or any of the things that Colleen's kind of touched on already. So there are things that we can do to embed those 3 adult signature practices within our regular meeting structures. And Colleen, did you want to add anything to that?
This, again, the 3 signature practices are, again, a way that we can mirror what we do for the students. For the adults, they're like practices. You can do the 3 signature practices also with your students. And so it's kind of like the chicken and the egg, starting it with the adults first. So the adults get really used to, okay, welcoming ritual, engaging practices, optimistic closure, like boom, boom, boom. Once you practice it and you know it, and then it's really easy to transition that into the classroom, or you could begin in the classroom and then begin incorporating it with your adults.
Thank you. Thanks for that ad. Okay, and then on the next slide, let's see there. I think we just have a few more pieces before we wrap up. Oh, next, please. We realized we couldn't have you guys annotate in this format. So one kind of closing quote that we really felt matched our content for the day is this one: culture building as a matter of continuous experimentation. And so this is not a perfect process. It's going to be messy. There's not a cookie cutter way to do this, but just making sure that you're open to that approach of just always continually refining things and rebuilding as is necessary for your context. So with that, on the next slide, we'll come to our optimistic closure, which is one of the 3 SEL signature practices. If you would please share with us, what is one word to describe how you're feeling now?
That's not what it says on the screen, though, Ginny.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Okay. I think all you can do is laugh at this point. It
okay,
is
well, you could add one word to describe how you're feeling now. You could also, if there's something you're considering integrating for your students and adults to support SEL and PBIS, you could share that. I guess one word to describe how I'm feeling now is relieved that we got through this and that everybody was able to see some slides while we were talking.
That's the basic. And then Shanaz asked if it was possible to get to link to the PDF presentation. Yes, it's on the participant guide. We included all of our slides and additional resources. Some of the things that we had to skip by today just to cut down for content, and then everything that was included today also.
Yeah, so the conference folks have provided an agenda with digital access to all of these resources. So, so hopefully you'll be able to find that. Google Jamboard is a nice way to do annotating in a virtual setting. Yes. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you all for being here. On the next slide is our contact information. If you had anything that you wanted to ask us about, we have 2 more minutes, I believe. If you could type that in the chat. Otherwise, there's our contact information for future. And Colleen, did you want to add any final words?
No, thank you for being patient with us as we went along through our massive slide deck that we ended up paring down. So I appreciate your patience with it.
Oh, and Jenny put in the chat a link to where you can find the agenda and the materials. Sherry, can we get access to the video of this? I'm not sure. I don't know if the video of the session will be available on the conference platform.
I'm so glad there's a video recording of that.
Okay, so well, thank you all for being a part of our presentation today and spending an hour of your time. And we hope you found a piece of that helpful. And again, thank you for your grace while we dealt with some of our technical issues. And we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much.